Mi zaenkrat, zdaj bi prosil Toma Raja, da Luka sam predstaviš njegov predstav. Tom Raj je do lani bil profesor v Edinburgu, zdaj je zamenjal službo in je profesor na Norveškem. Deloma tudi zdaj sodeluje z Urbanističnim inštitutom Republike Slovenije, reden gost naših treningov, partner oziroma svetovalec v večjih projektih, od Civitasa naprej. Naše zadnje delo pa je bilo v projektu Push and Pull, ki se je ravno s parkingom ukvarjal. Kot rečeno, če je kako vprašanje vmes, prosim, dvignite roko, postavite v slovenščini in bomo probali diskusijo zapeljati.
Okay. Dobro jutro. That's as much as I'll do in Slovene. Sorry. So yeah, it's traditional to tell a joke. I'll tell you a real joke. I was coming back from the European Parking Association conference, possibly the most boring conference you can possibly imagine. And when I got back, my car had been towed away. So there's a bit of irony there, I think, to start off with. So we've got 16 good reasons for parking management. Or is it in Slovenian, does it just say 16 reasons for parking management?
No, it's good.
Oh, good, okay. And I'm going to do 8, and then Aljaž will do 8. And these are also in this booklet here, but also on the website. Some of the reasons have got more. There's more information about them that you can look at. Because there's a lot of good reasons for parking management. That's why you're all here, I suppose, because you want to think about them. But also, what I would strongly encourage you to do is think, well, these reasons that are being presented to me that we're talking about today, are those reasons relevant to my city? Or what questions do I have about those reasons as they apply to my city? Are they applicable to my city? And I have to say, you know, although I am an academic who has studied and researched parking and also worked in a municipality on parking, and I've been doing various of those things for the last 15 years, there are lots of questions that we still don't know very much about in relation to parking. So, you know, what I present here, what Aljaž presents here, it's not like the absolute God's truth. It's what we understand based on the evidence that we have available, but there probably are other sides to it, and we need to discuss those today, because it's a tricky issue, parking. It's a controversial issue, as you all know. It's an issue that people get very emotional sometimes about, yeah? You know, I was so angry today that we couldn't find a parking space directly outside this building, and we had to walk 25 meters. God, I was angry about that. But just generally, you know, people do get very worked up about parking. So that's why it's a tricky issue. But anyway, these good reasons, because we've only got a certain amount of time. Yeah. Very good. Did you change that? Very good. Right, yeah. We're working in a project which is about climate change, which is about ultimately maybe making some changes to the way that people travel in order to have some beneficial effects on quality of life, on environment, hopefully on economy as well, and so on. So if we want to manage urban mobility, there is no doubt from the evidence that if you want to have some changes in the way that people travel, it's not sufficient just to improve the alternative modes of transport. There also has to be something that you do to make it a little bit more difficult to travel by car. That's not something you necessarily have to do overnight or in one big step. But all the cities that have really, you know, changed the way that people travel and reduced how much people travel by car, they've all done a bit of making it a little bit more difficult in places at certain times to travel by car, as well as improving the alternatives. And let's face it, parking management is something that can make it a little bit more expensive or make you think twice about whether you're going to use the car. But the point of this slide, I mean, it says that some kind of push measure is usually needed in managing urban mobility, and it's true. But then what push measures are there? And this compares two push measures, disincentive measures if you like, or sometimes called stick measures. Maybe I should have started the presentation with the carrot, not the stick, but anyway. If you look at this, there's two maps. And one map's got lots and lots and lots of dots on it, and one map has got almost no dots on it. And the first map shows roughly, in fact, if we plotted them all, there'd be far more than this, but you know, many, many, many cities have already started to implement, or have very complex parking management systems. On the other hand, charging for roads that already exist, not new roads, but charging for city road use, almost no cities have done that. On the slide, there's a couple in Italy, quite a few in Norway, as it happens, and Sweden, and one in Britain, and that's about it. So the point is, on the one hand, parking management, it's relatively, as a push measure, as a disincentive measure, then it's quite well accepted. I'm not saying it's not as accepted as building a bike path or something, but you know, as a disincentive measure, it's quite well accepted. You can implement it quite quickly. It doesn't rely on any complex or expensive technology. It's not that expensive to implement. On the other hand, you know, there's, believe it or not, that's Stockholm on there. Stockholm's system of road pricing cost 200 million euros to implement. The same in London, 200 million euros back in the mid-2000s. Very expensive, something that you have to do on a big scale. So parking management is a well-known, relatively accepted, relatively cheap and quick to implement push measure, and it's a measure that you can start at a very small scale, one street, a few parking spaces, and then build outwards from there. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, what about how space is distributed in our cities? Because one of the things that maybe we want to do is make our cities more pleasant places to be, spend time in. And space on the street, obviously, that's taken up by parking is space that you could use for something else. And this graph here, it's done by colleagues in Graz, so should I call it Gradec? Not too far away. And it just compares the amount of space for, they call it, all right, sorry, stationary traffic. What they mean is parked traffic. So if you sit on a bench, then you're a pedestrian who parks. A parked pedestrian, if you get the idea. And the basic point is, there's the vast majority of the public space that's devoted to parked traffic is devoted to parked vehicles. So 92% of the space for parked traffic is for parked vehicles. On the other hand, when you compare that to how people travel overall in Graz, you can see only 47% of trips in Graz are made by car and the rest by other modes of transport. So it's a very uneven distribution of space. Now, you might not want to get this down to 47%, but you might want to make a change in the situation. And it illustrates the cost, the opportunity cost of the parking.
And another point to this is that the highest quality public space is occupied. That's another problem which is quite often here in Slovenia. Like all the coastal cities have the top public square.
In Slovenia.
Oh, yeah, whatever. Yeah, Torej, dodatno je še, da imamo v Sloveniji, pa tudi marsikje drugje, najkvalitetnejše javne prostore zasedene s parkingom. Ne. To vedno ponavljamo, recimo v vseh obalnih mestih. Izola ima osrednji trg za oba glavna trga za parkirana. Slomško trg v Mariboru, eden najlepših trgov, sigurno v mestu, še zmeraj v veliki meri za parkirati. Pa je lahko vsak jih našteje svoje občine. To je pa še dodaten problem tega. Veliko prostora, ampak tudi najkvalitetnejši prostor je pogosto za parkirati.
Hvala. What happens? How do you actually travel? How does it change people's way of travel? There isn't a huge amount of data on this, but here's some. We need to change the slide. Okay. Some data from Munich, which just go to show how the implementation of parking management on street in Munich changed the way that people travel. So 14% overall reduction in car use, and an increase in cycling, and an increase in walking. So there is absolutely no doubt that when parking management is introduced, people change the way that they travel. And that is one of the things that we are, in the end, trying to work towards. Not shocking, massive, overnight change, but some change. Okay. And of course, something that can be of extreme interest to people who continue to use the car, want to use the car. I am sure that when we discuss this later, many of you from municipalities will say a problem that we have is that there's not enough parking, and people complain that it takes them too long to find a parking space. That's usually concentrated in a small number of areas. But what happens if you do introduce management of those parking spaces to cut the amount of time that individual parkers can park for, or to charge in the areas where there's a very high demand? You will cut the amount of time that people spend traveling around looking for a parking space. So this data is from Vienna and districts 6 to 9, and the average parking search time. So there's time that each person looking for a parking space spent looking for that space dropped from 9 minutes to 3 minutes. I've also seen some very good data from Belgrade after the introduction of its first parking management zone. So very similar results. That there was a big drop in the proportion of people driving around looking for a parking space. Not surprisingly, but obviously this is congestion that happens in the already most congested parts of town, often. And so if you can do something about it, great, and parking management does something about it. This is a little bit more on the sort of the public acceptance side as well. This is about if you implement different types of transport measure, then how effective are they at reducing the amount of fuel that's used for travel? So that's a kind of measurement of how effective they are as a sustainable transport measure, and how acceptable they are. So on the graph, this is the acceptability, the public acceptability. So things that are very not acceptable to the public, not very surprisingly, increasing fuel prices, not very acceptable at all, high level of unacceptability, pricing, charging for the use of existing roads in cities, also not very acceptable. The one that's in the middle is parking management. So it's about 50-50 parking rate, 50-50 level of acceptability, so 50% support, 50% not support. But its effectiveness at influencing the way that people travel is high, that's on this axis, when we compare it with measures that are very, very acceptable. So the measures that are very, very acceptable are things like increasing the public transport supply or pedestrianisation and bicycle lanes. But in terms of influencing the way that people travel, those have much less effect. So the point is that really, really, really unpopular measures have a big influence on how people might travel, but they're so unpopular, it's very difficult to implement them in most places. The measures that maybe are more acceptable, or most acceptable, are the things that in the short to medium term have less effect on the way that people travel. Parking management sits somewhere in the middle. And I think that's quite an interesting finding, right?
Mi smo zdaj, ko delamo analizo, kaj se dogaja v CPS-ih po Sloveniji, ne, ugotavljamo, da je glavnina ukrepov vseeno tule. Ne. Da v bistvu večina CPS-ov se ukvarja z sprejemljivimi ukrepi, ki jih je dokaj enostavno izvesti, ampak njihov učinek na spremembe potovalnih navad je pa dokaj majhen. The measures are focused on those.
Well, I would say it's not just in Slovenia that that's the case. I mean, and what you can see on this graph, it doesn't mean that parking management is easy to implement, yeah, but it means it's easier than these things. All over the SUMP world, we find more of a tendency to want to implement these things, but probably, as I've said before, to bring about more change, there's got to be a bit of the parking management. Also, the other measure that's not on there, it's not strictly speaking relevant to today's seminar, but it was mentioned, was the circulation plan, because I think it was in your presentation. There might be some more training on the circulation plan, which is how you start to influence the way that people can travel through the city by different modes of transport, by selective closure of streets. That's another measure that can make a difference. But don't think it's just a Slovenian thing, that SUMPs tend only, especially first SUMPs, tend only to concentrate on the things at the right-hand end of the graph. This is again the acceptability issue, but I've certainly found this out from my own research. I've done research in big organizations that have implemented parking management for their staff. And the people that we interviewed said, well, before we were going to implement parking management, when we was planning it, we kept getting death threats and things like that from a few members. There was a lot of opposition. I'm sorry, exaggerate death threats, but certainly, a lot of angry people. And then after it was implemented, the opposition stopped. There might one or two people carried on moaning, but everybody else was okay about it. And you see the same here in the Vienna situation, where I have to consult my English stuff, but basically, especially residents, their opinion became much more accepting after the implementation of the measures. But even the non-residents here, their level of acceptance almost got to the positive side. So this is a very, very typical response. But I was talking to one colleague here about parking management and a politician's views of parking management here in a Slovenian city, where, having introduced some parking management, that politician has now found that, yeah, okay, I accept this actually does work. And that's the reason why people are accepting this. The residents in particular are one group who usually benefit from parking space management, and hence their improved acceptance. This relates to Aljaž's point. There's a lot of historic urban centres in Slovenia, in many European cities. This is an example from Ghent. Oh, My example is from Ghent in Belgium. Your example is from Ljubljana. I suppose you know it better. Put me off now. Right, but you get the idea, you know. Although, well, there is some parking on your picture. On my picture of Ghent, there's more parking and less moving traffic on the picture on the left-hand side. But the picture on the right-hand side is the same kind of idea. You create the public space from where was previously the space for vehicles. And yeah, there are many good arguments for doing this, which I'll go into actually on the next slide, I think. Yeah. This is a very, very important point, and I'm sure a point that you deal with politically, with your politicians, with your shopkeepers, with your local businesses. And it's the issue of how does parking relate to the economy, especially of town and city centres. These data are old. I put these data together myself, and they are now, my God, 20 years old. So perhaps I should revisit this data and redo it again. In fact, he's kind of my boss now, so boss, can you tell me to do this again, all right? Yeah. But the basic point is, what I tried to do here, I took data, this is British data, and I looked at the ranking, ranking of the shopping centre. So how well is the shopping centre doing? Is the shopping centres in cities across Britain? So how well are they doing? There's various companies that produce rankings. That's how well is each centre doing in comparison to the other. And then I looked at how much parking was provided per metre of shop floor space. So this is the ranking, this is the parking. So if there were a relationship between the amount of parking provided and how well the shopping centre were doing, then basically it should be like that, because these are the best performing ones up here, and these are the less well performing ones. So the line should go something like that the best performing shops or centres should have the most parking. But you can see actually the line is something like this. Yeah, basically if I fit a line on this graph, it goes like that. And for those of you who are students of regression analysis, what does that mean? If the line is flat, it means is there a relationship or is there not a relationship? And you can say that in Slovenian.
There can be a correlation, but still, we are not aware of all the factors.
Okay,
so
yeah.
It's a question of a model and the inputs into the model.
Far too complicated answer. Anybody else want to do the simple answer? I've only plotted two figures on this graph, two factors. You are right, there could be many other, that is the point. There are many other factors. Exactly. So all I've done here is try to establish the relationship between parking and how successful the shopping centre is. And there does not appear to be any relationship, because a flat line means there is no relationship between the factors, which means there are probably other factors that are influencing, am I starting to talk too fast? That are influencing why these shopping centres are doing better than these shopping centres. And I also looked at how much the shopping centres charged for parking for shoppers, and actually the most successful shopping centres charge more for parking, which kind of suggests that like, if the shopping centre is doing well, you can charge more because there's more demand for parking for people to come there to shop. Okay, caveats, problems with these data. Number one, they're old, so I have to do them again. Number two, they're from Britain. That's not of itself a problem, but they're only from one country. Number three, they're from quite large cities. And I have to say that almost all the work that I'm aware of that has been done on the relationship between parking and economic vitality, retail vitality, has been focused on larger cities. So there is a bit of a lack of knowledge about the situation in smaller cities. Yeah? So these data, if you did them for small cities in Slovenia or any country, you might get a different result. We don't know. But what I would like to say is, what are the other factors then? In these cities, if parking doesn't seem to have a relationship with retail vitality or with how successful the shops are, what things are making the shops successful, do you think? Because there is work, there's academic work on this, there's research on this. What things might be making the shops successful? What do you think, sir? What's your name? Matthias. Okay.
Prijazno osebje in seveda tudi dostopnost do drugih bližnjih ustanov, kot so banke, lekarne in podobno.
So the kindness of the staff and the distance to other facilities or services.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that's really good. Yeah.
We have an example in Maribor. I think we have people from Maribor here. We have very successful shopping mall which is very close to the city center, and then less successful ones at the outskirts, if I understand well. So the distance from the city center, okay, which brings also pedestrians, cyclists, and other shoppers.
Yeah. I mean, you said kindness of the staff, how friendly the staff are. In general, any other aspects of the shops? What do you think, Maria? Anything else that might? Yeah, the assortment. Yeah. The sort of the offer. What kind of shopping can you do? The quality of the shops. Anything not to do with the shops, though? Anything else? Anything to do with the wider environment?
Which is the next argument then?
Okay, is it?
Yeah.
Which is your argument?
Yeah.
Okay. So we neatly pass on to Aljaž. Sorry, Maria, yeah?
No, I was just joking. Females, they have to get nice shoes.
Use the microphone. Yeah, use the microphone. It's not for the camera.
But as a researcher, I have to say, we need to do more research on this, particularly in relation to smaller cities.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Tom. Any question for Tom? Otherwise, we'll have a discussion at the end of these arguments. So I'll switch to Slovene. Jaz bom naslednjih 8 predstavil, kot rečeno, vsi so v brošuri. Naslednji je zelo povezan s to temo, ki jo je zdaj Tom odprl in je v bistvu zelo močna, relevantna v Sloveniji. Če se sam recimo spomnimo Kamnika, meni je Kamnik eden močnejših primerov, ko so v bistvu preuredili mestno središče, ga zaprli za motorni promet, in če se zdaj prehodite tam za vikend, recimo, je to mrtvo mesto, praktično brez žive duše, medtem ko shopping centri v okolici veselo cvetijo. Ne. In posod, recimo, ko smo delali prometno strategijo za Novo mesto, je bila to glavna skrb zaprtja mestnega središča, ali bo mestno središče uspelo konkurirati selitvi dejavnosti na rob. In kar je z vidika parkinga, en argument je Tom že omenil, da ni neposredno kakovost pa razpoložljivost parkinga vezana na to. Ne. Raziskave kažejo tudi, da so prebivalci ali pa obiskovalci pripravljeni parkirati malo stran, in če je kvaliteten dostop do teh središč zagotovljen, pripravljeni tudi nekaj prehodi za ta središča. In potem pridejo v poštev vsi ti drugi faktori, ki smo jih prej slišali, dobra ponudba, kvalitetno okolje, druge dejavnosti, prostor, ki postaja nek točka srečevanja in preživljanja tudi prostega časa. Ne. Tako da ni vse vezano na parking, je pa to velika težava in velika diskusija, kadarkoli odpremo to temo v slovenskih, predvsem mestnih središčih, je to še zmeraj vroča tema, na katerega nimamo enostavnega odgovora. In je vedno težko prepričati predvsem politike lokalne na to temo. Naslednji argument je, da podjetja zaradi upravljanja parkiranja ne bodo prenehali investirati ali pa se locirati v to mesto. Spet stvar, ki temelji na raziskavah. Imamo tu podatke od Nizozemske do Anglije, kjer so spraševali direktorje firm v mestih, kjer so se zapirali pa oteževala parkiranje, ali je to vplivalo na njihovo poslovanje. Njihov odgovor je bil, da je kvaliteta bivanja v teh mestih še zmeraj takšna, da z veseljem ostanejo kljub težavam s tem parkiranjem. Spet imamo drugo zgodbo v manjših slovenskih mestih, nimamo čistega odgovora, karkoli smo delali do sedaj s podjetji, je bilo parkiranje ali pa omejevanje parkiranja osnovna težava in njegovo omejevanje se je imenovalo tudi kot lahko težava za pridobivanje zaposlenih, recimo mobilnostni načrt za industrijsko cono v Zrečah. Eden glavnih argumentov je bil že tako, na trgu ni delovne sile našega profila, če bomo otežili parkiranje, bomo imeli s tem še večje težave in tu smo težko dali nasprotni argument proti temu. Potem imamo pa neke ukrepe, ki so že del mobilnostnih načrtov, da je veliko bolj racionalno organizirati druge načine, ceneje in podobno, ampak to je tema, ki jo bomo obravnavali na enem od prihodnjih izobraževanj, kako upravljati mobilnost na ravni ustanov podjetje. Pa imamo naslednji razlog, to je dejstvo, ki ga v bistvu poznamo že iz teorije vsakodnevne, ampak tu imamo tudi številke. Če imate zagotovljeno parkirno mesto pred hišo ali pa pred svojim domom in na drugi strani parkirno mesto pred svojim podjetjem, ki je zastonj, enostavno dostopno, boste v največjem delu primerov uporabljali avto. Vedno se najde izgovor. Mi smo imeli sodelavca na inštitutu, ki je porabil več časa, da je prišel peš do avta in ga pripeljal v službo, kot če bi prišel peš v službo, z argumentom, jaz zmeraj moram kam skočiti ali pa ga bom popoldne rabil. In je v bistvu hodil z avtom, čeprav je za to porabil bistveno več časa in energije. In x teh razlogov je, v Zrečah smo slišali, polovica naših delavcev pa še popoldne fuša in ne bo zgubljala časa, da pride iz tega delovnega mesta na novega in podobno. Ampak dejstvo je, če poenostavimo, če parkirno mesto zagotovimo in je to brezplačno, se nam bo večina zaposlenih sigurno vozila na delovno mesto. In to lahko sigurno iz svoje prakse poveste. Ali pa imamo Škofjo Loko tukaj, vi ste začeli zaračunavati zaposlenim na občini parkirno mesto, a ste koga prepričali, da je menjal svoje potovalne navade?
Ja, lep pozdrav. Mi smo začeli tam, mislim, da 2010 na službenem parkirišču zaračunavati sicer za simbolno ceno 100 evrov na leto, ampak je bil to tak lep razlog, da smo tudi drugim povedali, da pred njihovimi ustanovami ne morejo imeti zastonj parkiranja. Mi, ko smo potem najprej uvedli izboljšanje javnega prevoza skupaj z direkcijo oziroma z ministrstvom, smo imeli en tak lep argument, da smo rekli, pred zdravstvenim domom pa vi ne morete imeti zastonj parkiranja, ker ga tudi mi nimamo. Smo bili mi vzgled njim in potem smo pač to naprej razširjali. Tako da treba začeti pri sebi, tisti, ki to politiko uveljavlja, da jo potem tudi, da si lahko kot dober zgled tudi drugim in brez tega ne gre.
A ste kaj sprememb ugotovili?
Mislim, seveda so bile pritožbe, predvsem z teh javnih zavodov, so še nekje tudi, rečemo, zastonj parkirišča, so težave s parkiranjem, imamo še polno izzivov za letošnje naslednje leto, tako da še kar nekaj čaka. Ne, točnih podatkov ne.
Diplomatsko si zaokrožil. Ok, hvala, ampak to je sigurno dejstvo, da če vsi smo krvavi pod kožo, vsi najdemo argumente, če bomo imeli parking na cilju in na izvoru potovanj, bomo v veliki meri uporabljali avto, tu skoraj ni dileme. Pa imamo naslednji argument, da upravljanje parkiranja prispeva k varnosti na cesti, torej parkiranje oziroma njegovo upravljanje je pomemben faktor varnosti. Tule vidimo razloge, predvsem v okolici šol, ustanov, kjer imamo otroke, torej naše soprebivalce niže rasti, je parkiranje velika težava, predvsem zaradi tega, ker tudi na prehodu, če je prehod spostavljen, parkiranje povzroči, da otroci niso vidni na teh prehodih. In to je redna težava vseh okolic šol ali pa šolskih poti, ki se pogosto ne zavedamo, čeprav se praviloma spostavlja pri nas rumen pas, ampak je ta nek zaščitni pas, kjer se ne parkira v določeni razdalji. Ta pas je praviloma vedno zaparkiran v konicah, ko starši peljejo otroke v šolo in podobno. Tako da to je velika težava. Ena od rešitev, ki smo pred kratkim v Ljubljani izpostavili, je, da smo ta rumen pas izkoristili za parkiranje koles na šoli, kjer je kolesarjenje zelo popularno in je kolesarnica vedno polna in se je zdaj to izkazalo za precej močan prispevek v varnosti in vidnosti otrok na tem prehodu. Čeprav so zdaj začeli seveda starši ustavljati in parkirati na samem prehodu zjutraj. Zdaj tu še ne vemo, kaj bi razen ozaveščanje. Ima kdo kak primer fizične ovire, ki bi ta del preprečil in ne onemogočal pešce, mi ga še nismo našli. Ampak skratka, to je in težava, katero se je treba zavedati, ne, in jo je treba reševati, predvsem v okolici šol, zdravstvenih domov, posod telovadnic, športnih društev, kjer imamo otroke in to težavo. Kaznovanje, kakorkoli nepriljubljeno, je nujno in ključno za uspešno parkirno politiko in je v bistvu ključ tudi do pravilnega ali pa pravičnega prometnega sistema pri nas. Slika, ki je zakrožila po svetu, pred kratkim sodelujemo z Podgorico pri izdelavi, v Črni Gori pri izdelavi njihovega celostne prometne strategije in jo uporabljajo kot močno komunikacijsko orodje, ker če mi mislimo, da imamo težave z ilegalnim parkiranjem v Sloveniji, jo imajo oni na ne vem katero potenco. Tam je v bistvu, imajo primere, ko zaparkira kak velik ego vstop v javno parkirišče, da 4 žmigavce in gre za 10-15 minut urediti svoje zadeve in blokira vstop ali pa izstop na javno parkirišče in nimajo pravega orodja tega. No to je pa slika, ki je precej vznemirila in zakrožila in tudi veliko tega karikira. V bistvu z neizvajanjem, nekaznovanjem, ne zagotavljanjem nadzora nad parkiranjem, v bistvu vplivamo na najobčutljivejše uporabnike v prometnem sistemu. Lahko si predstavljamo tudi mamo z vozičkom, ki mora na prometno cesto, da obkroži, ampak ta je bila situacija, ki se mi zdi najbolj povedna. O standardih bo Luka več govoril kasneje, ampak so eden od teh 16 argumentov, ki je zelo močen. Parkirni standardi imajo zelo močan vpliv na to, kam se neke dejavnosti selijo, predvsem pa kakšen vpliv na prometni sistem v naselju imajo. Ampak kot rečeno, Luka bo več o tem povedal. Če pa želimo imeti neko učinkovito upravljanje parkiranja v našem naselju, v naši občini, moramo najti pravo ravnotežje med višino parkirnin in pa ustreznim nadzorom nad tem. Brez enega ali drugega naš sistem parkiranja ne bo funkcioniral, bodisi bomo imeli preslabo ponudbo ali pa bomo imeli preveč ilegalnega parkiranja. Skratka, najti ta balans je ključen, da ne bo naša prometna ali pa politika upravljanja parkiranja v našem mestu uravnotežena. Več o cenah in določene cene potem v naslednjem sklopu argumentov. In pa zadnji, to je bil v bistvu srž tega projekta Push and Pull, že samo ime pove, push and pull, potisni in potegni, oziroma kakorkoli bi ga, torej kombinacija korenčka in palice. Glavna ideja tega projekta je bila, da razširi vedenje ali pa prakso mest, kjer uporabljajo glavnino prihodkov svojih pridobljenih skozi parkirnine za investiranje v alternative osebnemu motornemu prometu. Imamo tu podatke, recimo za Amsterdam je bil en tak primer, oni letno, sam da poiščem te številke, oni letno pridobijo skozi parkirnine okrog 160 milijonov, a se je številka gor, ne? 160 milijonov evrov in praviloma je praksa pri nas, pa tudi v regiji, da večino tega denarja gre neposredno nazaj v občinski proračun. Še večja težava je, da imamo pogosto zelo bogata javna podjetja, ki prevelik delež teh prihodkov obdržijo zase. Primer, predvsem po Balkanu, je to, ko so recimo parkirni servis Beograda je verjetno najbogatejše javno podjetje na Balkanu in je tudi vir marsikaterih političnih odločitev in zaposlitev. Skratka, oni so zelo uspešni v širjenju parkirnih območij v zaračunavanju parkiranja, v preganjanju ilegalnega parkiranja, ampak njihova težava je, da ves te denar zadržijo zase. Ne. Tu imamo primer, kako naprednejša mesta to počnejo, ko velik del tega dajo nazaj v sklad za mobilnost. Imamo primer Genta v Belgiji, kjer so ustanovili agencijo za mobilnost, katere glavni prihodek so prihodki iz parkiranja. In potem oni z zelo močno agencijo preko 100 zaposlenih, ki se ukvarja z področjem mobilnosti v velikosti mesta Ljubljane. V Ljubljani imamo verjetno 10 zaposlenih, ki se s tem področjem ukvarja, pa še to del njih zelo operativno, moče 1, 2, tadej mahaš 3. Skratka 3 proti, ne vem, tam jih je 100, tega je verjetno 30 strateških zaposlenih, ampak zelo pomembno je, da se financirajo iz prihodkov za parkiranje. Ampak ta številka je, mislim, ta prihodek je relevant tudi za manjše občine, tudi tam je treba ta mehanizem spostaviti, ker je v bistvu na koncu to politična odločitev. Če se večina denarja ohrani kot poseben vir za investicije, za implementacijo celostnih prometnih strategij, je to veliko boljša popotnica, kot če se ta denar neposredno zgubi v celotnem proračunu in je potem treba vsako leto izpogajati nazaj te deleže za implementacijo celostnih prometnih strategij. Zato se mi zdi, da je ta tema relevantna za vse občine prisotne ali pa občine v Sloveniji.